This year, the lecture series is about religious diversity. It's called Here Comes Everybody. There is a classic definition of Roman Catholicism given by a theologian once, and he said that the best definition of Catholicism is Here Comes Everybody. And tonight we are talking about religious pluralism in Canada, and we have Lois Sweet, who will present a talk called Separate Schools, Separate Communities, with a question mark, Pluralism and Education in Canada. I should say what this lecture isn't going to be about is what's wrong with Catholic schools. Apparently, Lois tells me there was some kind of release from St. Jerome's that went around saying that was the topic of tonight's lecture. And whereas that might provide some material for a long talk, long talk, that is not, in fact, the topic of tonight's lecture. This is the 2003 Joint Waterloo Catholic District School Board St. Jerome's University lecture. This jointly sponsored lecture is one public sign of the formal partnership established between the Waterloo Catholic District School Board and St. Jerome's University some 10 years ago, that is, back in 1993. It is a partnership that has served as a model for others in the country, and as has the lecture series that has grown out of it. And therefore, we are very pleased that we could have such an appropriate topic for this evening's lecture, that is, separate schools, separate communities. And we are very pleased that Lois Sweet, author of the very influential and provocative book, God in the Classroom, the controversial issue of religion in Canada's schools, is here to deliver that lecture. I have to say that I am working right now, I'm researching the topic of religion and education in Canada, and I would say my primary guide to that study has been Lois Sweet and this wonderful book, God in the Classroom. Though I have to also admit I have psychological problems, because when I read the title, God in the Classroom, I thought it was about me. I'm working on it. Lois is an assistant professor of journalism at Carleton University in Ottawa, and so it's wonderful that she can bring this perspective to this very timely topic. She began her work in journalism as a producer with the National Film Board of Canada in the Northwest Territories, a position which she left to become a producer at CBC Radio in Edmonton. In addition, she has served as a columnist for the Edmonton Journal and the Toronto Star. She was a feature writer for the latter paper, as well as its faith and ethics reporter. Lois has been the winner of both the Southam Fellowship and the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy, and it's during the tenure of that Atkinson Fellowship that she did the research and writing of this book, God in the Classroom. She has also been the recipient of the Associated Church Press Award for feature writing, a recognition that came from south of the border, as well as the Canadian Church Press Award for feature writing. So I know that you're anxious to meet Dr. Lois Sweet and for me to get away from this microphone. So without further ado, please help me welcome Lois Sweet.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much for inviting me to be with you tonight. The importance of tackling this issue of pluralism in education really struck home to me recently. But to tell you about it, I have to give you a little bit of background. David mentioned that I teach journalism at Carleton University, and this past year I had a new assignment. I was teaching first-year journalism students, 220 of them. And lectures revolved around, what is news, what are the tools that journalists use. We spent a lot of time looking at contemporary journalism. And I thought that it was really important that they do more than read about these things, but they actually get their feet wet. So for their last assignment, they had to come up with a story idea and then actually follow it through and write it. Before I tell you about that, though, I have to tell you that at the School of Journalism, accuracy and precision is absolutely, well, it's the thing that they all have to strive for. So if somebody misspells a proper name or a place name, they get 0 in an assignment. If they have a factual error, then they can be dropped an entire grade or get a 0 depending on the degree to which that factual error changes the nature of the story. Well, one student decided for her news story, what she was going to do was cover an event taking place at Carleton. A Christian philosopher sponsored by Campus for Christ had come on campus, and he was giving a talk. So she went to it and she wrote a news story on it. Well, that was fine. The problem is that when she got her mark back, she didn't really like it very much. It was a teaching assistant who had marked it. And the focus of her story was not really what this person had talked about, but it was really what was the reaction of people to his talk, who was there. Anyway, she contacted me and said, can you please have a look at this story? So I said that was fine. She came in, I read it, and I immediately knocked her mark by 1 entire grade. And she, of course, was very upset and couldn't understand why I had done that. And I said, well, you refer to the fact that what was so interesting about this evening was how many people attended who were not Christians. Muslims, for example, you said, and Catholics. Well, she still didn't get it. And I had to spell it out. I said, Catholics are Christians. And she said, well, they're not to me. Well, the ignorance displayed by this student, where did this idea come from? That Catholics are not Christians. Now, clearly she was a victim of a home, a school, and I certainly believe an education system that did not open her eyes to the realities and the beliefs of people around her. I think that one of the essential tasks of education is to provide young people with the opportunity of seeing the world through a different lens. And in her case, it would have been a corrective lens. I mean, how can somebody at this day and age think that way, especially when census figures tell us that Canada is one of the most diverse countries in the world? I don't know if you read the news reports, but last month Census Canada released its figures and referred to us as a kaleidoscope of cultures and languages, now more than 200 ethnic groups in this country, and of course a multitude of world religions. And if current trends continue, then by the year 2016, visible minorities, many of whom of course are not Christians, will account for 1/5 of our population. I guess another reason why I was shocked at what this student said was because it could have been me 30 years ago. But I had hoped that things had changed. I had really hoped that our young people were much more religiously literate. When I was growing up, there was a tremendous gulf between Protestants and Catholics, and we were not allowed to intermingle. I had no opportunity to get to know people in the community next to me because they were Catholic. And in fact, when it became clear that I was becoming interested in members of the opposite sex, my parents took me aside and said, there are 2 types of people you are not to date: hoodlums and, you guessed it, Catholics. Now, I couldn't understand this, but I did appreciate that when I went to high school, I went to high school with Catholics. There wasn't a separate Catholic school system then. And it was a process of demystification. It was a process of learning that Catholics are Christians. And those experiences definitely played a role in my thinking and in actually directing me in the work that I eventually did. Of course, ironically, I do have to add that the children of those people that I went to high school with now go to separate high schools where they don't have the opportunity or the likelihood of meeting someone like me. And I think that's a loss on both sides. Anyway, tonight I want to provide some context for understanding how our education system developed, then examine the current situation and explore whether it meets our needs in a pluralistic society. And finally, I'd like to recommend courses of action. To me, it's really, really important to understand how we got to where we are today. But it's also important to ask the question, is this the ideal system to respond to today's reality? And if not, well, what should we be doing? And are there any lessons to be learned based on our experience so far? How would a sensitivity to religious diversity inform our actions? Now, to my mind, it certainly wouldn't graduate a student from a high school who thought that Catholics weren't Christians. Because of the kind of community that I grew up in, I actually just assumed that conflict between Catholics and Protestants was an ongoing and central feature of life in Canada. But coming here tonight made me do some research, and I was actually surprised to learn that this isn't the case. And I'm grateful to Professor Mark McGowan at St. Michael's College, who shared his expertise with me. Now, I realize that what I'm going to say maybe in the next few minutes is not new to any of you. It may be old hat. So if so, please bear with me. But I think it's really important to go over this terrain because it is central to the issue. I was really surprised to learn that anti-Catholicism was not a central and constant feature of our history. It was there, but it arose in three distinct periods. During the first phase, from the British conquest to 1830, it was actually official government policy and actually restricted the religious and political freedom of Catholics. But I hasten to add, it wasn't just Catholics, it was also Protestant dissenters. There was a fear that Protestant dissenters and Catholics would challenge the privilege of Church of England and Church of Scotland. And in addition, the anti-Catholic laws were not implemented in what is today Ontario and Quebec. So if the first form of anti-Catholicism was motivated by politics, in the second phase certainly had the addition of theological motivation. And it occurred in the mid-1800s. Protestant spokespeople attacked both the doctrines and the practices of the Catholic Church. They challenged and derided such issues as the authority of tradition, the doctrine of transubstantiation, the veneration of Mary, the papacy, and auricular confession. And in fact, when I was reading about this, it struck me that those are exactly the same things that more than 100 years later were things that I grew up learning about. Anyway, it seemed that the mid-19th century attacks were based on two things. One was a fear that the kind of individual liberties that had been so hard won in Britain, the right to vote, freedom of speech, would be undermined by orders from Rome and then implemented by dictatorial priests. And the reason behind this fear was because of what was happening in Europe. Historians refer to it as papal aggression. The Pope had issued a proclamation that caused the newly appointed Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster to create a full Catholic hierarchy in England, complete with English territorial titles. This was the first time that this had happened since the Protestant Reformation, and Protestants were running scared. And the news of their fear and of the tensions quickly spread to the New World. The second justification for attacking Catholics came with the large influx of Irish refugees during the potato famine. They were, of course, desperately poor. They were disease-ridden. There were a host of other social problems. And the fact that they were Catholics was used as an argument to support the contention that there were serious social repercussions of adhering to Rome. And then the third phase happened when the West, the Canadian West, started to be open, and there were settlement and assimilation concerns, and Protestants wanted to make sure that people were assimilated as Protestants, and they fought hard for that. They weren't very successful, but anyway, it's the second stage that I want to refer to tonight. The stage, mid-1800s, fear of papal aggression and the Irish refugees, because that's the framework for our present education system, and it provides the context for the contemporary. I mean, we know that schools were a major focus of disagreement between Protestants and Catholics. Well, there's this tense climate, as I've just described, but in addition to that, unlike today, everybody accepted that religion, meaning Christianity, there wasn't any other kind then, religion and education were inextricably tied. The problem, of course, was whose version of Christianity. Protestants wanted to use the Bible as a textbook. Catholics supported having the clergy interpret the scriptures. Edgerton Ryerson, who was the superintendent of education in Upper Canada, or Ontario, promoted a kind of Christian ecumenicism, a generic Christianity that he thought should be in the schools, and Catholics rejected it outright. They wanted the education of their children to be characterized by a distinct Catholic interpretation. Now, of course, the struggle was exacerbated by the fact that Francophones from Lower Canada, or Quebec, actually dominated the legislature, and they used their powers to give additional educational rights to the minority English-speaking Catholics in Ontario. And those rights included allowing the Catholic minority to create and manage their own schools, and as well to get a share of the common school fund that the government provided. It's ironic to me that this sectionalism that helped create Catholic schools was actually one of the driving forces for Protestants in Upper Canada demanding an end to the union of Upper and Lower Canada, or Quebec and Ontario, and its broadening into what eventually became Confederation. They were actually trying to dilute the influence of Francophone Catholics. The upshot, though, of this new confederation would have left minority English-speaking Catholics in Ontario in a really vulnerable situation. So that's why Section 93 was added to the BNE Act, to Canada's first constitution. And that, as I'm sure you all know, is what protected the religious minorities at the time. It's why Catholic separate schools continue to be publicly supported in Ontario and in any other province where they were in existence when that province joined Confederation. And because of that protection, separate schools continue to exist, despite the fact that Catholics are no longer a minority religious community. And in fact, in Ontario, Catholics are the single largest religious group in this province. To me, it's really interesting that this debate over the schools went beyond separation based on religion to also separation based on race. And it was prompted by the fact that there were large numbers of fugitive slaves fleeing the States and coming into Canada. In 1850, the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and that allowed the kidnapping and selling of freed slaves back into slavery. So, of course, people tried to come to Canada. Bounty hunters still came into Canada to try and get them and take them back, but Ontario had passed an anti-slavery law in 1834, so they were protected. So in 1850, Ontario passed an act which gave colored people, as they define them, along with Protestants and Catholics, the option of opening their own schools. Now, the upshot for blacks was that many whites didn't want blacks in their schools, and so blacks had no option but to open their own schools. But they were poor, they were new to the country, and most of them really weren't in any position to do that. The legislation did provide for some funding, but the funding was tied to how many students attended school on a regular basis. And they, of course, were needed to work the fields and were not able to attend regularly. And in addition, the grants were based on property taxes, and they were very poor and for the most part weren't garnering much by way of property taxes. I found it really interesting to read about the debate that took place at that time between two prominent black leaders, a woman named Mary Ann Shadd and a woman named Mary Bibb, both of whom were teachers and both of whom were activists. Shadd wanted integrated schools. She believed that separate schools would undermine true freedom. She was afraid of ghettoization. She felt that integration was premised on equality. Bibb supported segregated schools. She felt that only by gaining strength through separation could blacks eventually gain equality. Now, of course, it's a classic argument, and it's one that continues to reverberate today. Mary Ann Shadd got money from a missionary society, and she opened her own school, an integrated school, but lost her funding, actually she's an interesting person in and of herself, she decided to start a newspaper, and as far as anybody knows, she's the first female black person in the world to become a publisher. She started a newspaper called Provincial Freeman, which she published for many years before returning to the States. Anyway, why would I talk about Mary Ann Shadd and the situation of fugitive slaves in this context? Well, because even in the 1850s, Canada was getting a taste of diversity, and we didn't handle it very well. The situation of blacks, to my mind, points to the fact that achieving social benefits depends on the ability to use the political process. Catholics did precisely that, and despite living in a climate of bad press, George Brown, who's the founder of the Globe, was really anti-Catholic. And in one of those interesting points of contradiction, he was an abolitionist. Anyway, it was a climate of bad press, fear-mongering, and religious bigotry. But despite that, Catholics were able to obtain distinct rights that had financial backing and legal clout, and blacks obtained neither. So, how best to achieve equality? Now, that was the focus of disagreement between Bibb and Shadd. One supported integration, the other segregation. Certainly, it's possible to argue that segregation leads to equality. I mean, just witness the situation of Catholic minorities in both Canada and the Netherlands. When I was researching my book, I visited the Netherlands to learn about its education system. It's a system that funds all religious schools as long as the religious schools meet certain government criteria. They have to have a minimum number of students, the teachers have to be certified, they have to teach the government-mandated curriculum, which includes the teaching of evolution and sex education, and they have to teach in the Dutch language. And today, if you talk to Dutch education authorities, they'll say that there was no way that they could possibly have been integrated and possibly have achieved the kind of success that they have today without being in their own separate schools. They were the underclass. Only 2% of them actually attended university before their separate schools started to get funding. Anyway, now they say we're emancipated, we're integrated. So then you say, well, why do you continue to have your schools? Well, they argue that, as Canadian Catholics argue, Catholic separate schools provide formation, that it's possible to teach character and morals based on Catholic principles, and that those are things that you wouldn't get in a secular school system. But had Canada followed the Netherlands example, then today we would have Salvation Army schools and Pentecostal schools and Hindu schools and Muslim schools and, so on. And certainly that's the position that's argued very eloquently by people for whom religion is their identity. In fact, on the West Coast, there are large numbers of Chinese who are pressing for their own schools using similar examples argued by religious groups. They want to provide a distinctly Chinese educational experience. They say our children need to know our culture and our language in order to achieve a place of equality in the larger society. And they argue that it can only be done in their own schools. Yet had blacks been in a position to operate segregated schools. I wonder what would have happened during the civil rights era of the 1960s. How do separate schools look when they're viewed through the lens of race as opposed to religion? Certainly the lobbying for publicly funded Chinese schools has not been embraced by Vancouverites. And I wonder what Dutch Catholic educators would tell me today. It's very interesting, the kind of debate that's taking place in the Netherlands today. There's a debate about whether it's racist to insist that immigrant cultures be subordinated to liberal democratic values. Can the Dutch insist that newcomers learn their language and that they learn the ground rules of the Dutch humanist tradition? For many people, their concern is that Dutch democracy is actually being lost, that there's a separate but equal multicultural broth that's churning away, and what the Netherlands was founded upon is being lost. So the major political party is actually arguing that residence permits be given to people who successfully finish an integration course, including competency in the Dutch language. And multiculturalism, which used to be talked about in very glowing terms, is now being discussed in terms of conflicting cultures and failed integration. You have to ask, where do separate schools fit into this framework? Now, while I understand the rationale, I can't support publicly funded religious schools. And I say that knowing that the Catholic system is full of teachers who are sensitive to issues of diversity. I know that there are a multitude of people who come out of the Catholic system who are tolerant, who are inclusive, and who are capable of coping with diversity. And I also say that knowing that the public system has many failings, not the least of which is its inability to provide sensitivity and education about the human experience of religion. But to my mind, we're talking tonight about what we should be working towards. What kind of school system best builds a natural inclination to inclusiveness as opposed to exclusiveness, that builds an understanding of religious difference as opposed to intolerance? And I find no grounds to argue that the ideal system separates people on a sectarian basis. And certainly as far as race goes, people to the south of us died to ensure that their schools became racially integrated, fervently believing that an evolved society doesn't separate people on a racial basis. So I don't believe that separate schools are the only route to emancipation and integration. And I use the word integration in its most positive sense. I use it in the sense that the Dutch use it. They argue that to be integrated into a society doesn't mean giving up your culture, your identity, your religion, who you are. To do that is assimilation. Integration, on the other hand, is adhering to a certain basic set of shared social values or rules that are valid to everybody. But in addition to that, you have your own identity that comes about through your culture or your religion. Now, I have no doubt but that my personal childhood experience contributed to my opposition to separate schools, but I don't approach this only from the personal. There is also the social and the political. And to my mind, this is where the current reality comes in. Canada is now a multicultural, multi-faith nation. We're diverse. We are diverse in ways that were absolutely unimagined in the 1850s. But diversity can be a curse or a blessing. It can bring conflict, as witnessed by the Protestant-Catholic conflicts in the past over schools. If supported in a certain way, though, to ensure equality between groups, it can, I believe, enrich society, and it can contribute to tolerance and understanding. I actually think that our survival as a country depends on social cohesion. And by social cohesion, I don't mean that we live in a Pollyanna society where we all agree with one another. What I mean by social cohesion is that we live in a environment in which we're able to air our differences, in a climate in which listening, respectful listening takes place, and acceptance, creating forums where conflicting worldviews are given credence. I mean, we're a situation where we operate from an assumption of equality, where a diversity of opinions and values and theories are debated and discussed. It means that everybody has the same opportunity to put forward their perspectives. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to get their way, or that the ideal is going to be the result. But in terms of religious pluralism, it means that every person whose views are informed by a religious faith, or no faith at all, has an equal place at the table of public input. Now, in other words, there's no enforced homogeneity. People from a variety of belief systems can contribute to the public forum and be respected for the contribution they make. And I have to question how this can come about if we separate our children in their formative years along religious lines, if they have no opportunity to confront reality, but instead rely on myths and stereotypes as perpetrated in pop culture or in the media. If those are the forums in which they learn about people who are different from themselves. There was a startling example of that, to my mind, a couple of weeks ago. I was reading the National Post. They're reading their coverage on the Inderjeet Singh Rayat decision in the Air India bombing. And on page 2, they had 3 charts, and those charts had a breakdown of the number of people who died, and I'd identified them on the basis of religion, nationality, and age. So, of course, I was reading this, and I looked at the religion chart, and the list showed the number of Hindus, the number of Sikhs, the number of Christians, the number of Roman Catholics. It was not a subcategory. It was as a separate. It even had a Pentecostal there. There was one Pentecostal on the Air India flight, and that person also was not identified as a Christian. And then at the very end, they had Protestants. I mean, and I'm telling you, these are not subcategories. These are all separate. So to me, I mean, what a perfect example of religious illiteracy among journalists. And once again, of an education system that failed them. The media are influential. Just ask any Muslim who reads the National Post and is offended on virtually a daily basis. I think we have to care about religious sensitivity and insensitivity among journalists, especially in a diverse society. They should be accurate, they should be precise, and they should not be perpetuating ignorance. We also live in a post-9/11 era, and the context is constantly changing. Racial profiling is becoming acceptable. It almost seems as if one's rights as a Canadian citizen depend on your ethnic origin. So it's critical that all Canadians stand together to prevent the further erosion of civil rights of minorities, or civil rights based on their religious convictions. September 11th certainly pointed out how little most Canadians know about Islam. Few seem to realize that Muslims are not a monolithic group of believers. The media played catch up, but they had a long way to go. And they started from the assumption that there were no subdivisions between Muslims or within Islam, or, in fact, diversity of thought. So how do we best prepare our young people to cope in a very complex world, in a diverse society? Well, as I said, to me, education is one of the keys. Education that opens young people's minds and eyes to diversity of thought, that challenges them to think for themselves. And to me, this doesn't mean supporting separate schools based on a historic situation that has no modern counterpart. I think what we need now are schools that confront reality, that represent a contemporary logic. If Canada is to succeed as a multicultural, racially cohesive society, then we have to educate children in ways that inculcate respect and civility for difference, including religious difference, by exposing them to it. Now, to my mind, one of the ways to do this is through fostering what I call religious literacy, educating children to have a knowledge and an awareness of world religious thought and to develop their sense of citizenship within a diverse society. How would you foster religious literacy? Well, I'd say you'd start very young. You'd start in the classroom and you'd provide it through all kinds of different subjects: history, art, literature, and the study of world religions. It wouldn't be an add-on. It wouldn't be something that, yes, in grade 11 you take world religions. You take for 1 year out of your 12 years of schooling. It's something that you would do through time on a regular basis. Religiously literate young people would be encouraged to think critically about matters of the spirit in order to enrich their own spiritual lives, their own human development. Religious literacy would be a way of giving them both a map and tools that would help them navigate in the waters of religious diversity. To me, religious literacy means moving beyond specific doctrines of belief and encountering and being able to respectfully analyze the beliefs of others, and to actually see that enterprise as personally worthwhile. It would be a way of challenging young people to grapple with the meanings and implications of different religious beliefs and develop their own perspectives at the same time. Religious literacy, to me, is the opposite of indoctrination. I don't believe that the purpose of education is to indoctrinate young people in a particular religion. Religious practice is a legitimate form of study, but the practice of religion, to my mind, doesn't belong in a classroom. Having said that, I think that the public system has a lot to learn from Catholic schools, because Catholic schools do attempt to take religion seriously, to take the religious experience seriously, and do attempt to inculcate in young people a respect for the spiritual. Certainly those early Protestants back in the 1850s, who thought that they too were being guaranteed religion in the schools, would be appalled to learn that today public means the absence of religious study. They'd be shocked to hear proponents of public education argue that the public system is religiously neutral. That's an absolutely ridiculous contention to make in light of its overbearing and overriding value system, which is secular humanism. It's a system that asserts that religious thought has no place in the classroom. And as played out in Ontario's public schools, it's actually hostile to people who are religious and to the beliefs that they hold. It's true that the province that seems most vehemently opposed to the serious pursuit of religion as a course of study is Ontario. Alberta, on the other hand, has actually introduced legislation to allow alternative religious schools to operate under the public system. Any religious group that's willing to conform with the standards that the province sets can open in Alberta. They do have to have a certified teacher, though, and they have to follow the government curriculum. And the alternate religious programs are housed, where it's possible, actually in the public school or very close by. And the argument there is that it gives the children an opportunity to intermingle and share in all the extracurricular activities with children from the public system, or the secular system. Now, that is a reasonable option to pursue. I do have a couple of qualms about it. First is, yes, that's fine for the children who are in the alternative religious program to get some religious study, but there's no requirement that children from the public system have any religious study. They're not formally reduced to world religion. So to my mind, it doesn't answer the primary requirement of religious literacy. And of course, the other thing is that the children in the alternative religious program only get educated about their specific religion. And this, too, is not the route, to my mind, to religious literacy. But I think it is a step forward insofar as the public system is finally recognizing a responsibility to support the education of children from religious homes who want religion to be an integral part of their child's education. And in another glimmer of hope, also in Alberta, the Calgary Board of Education voted last year to introduce a mandatory world religions class in all of its schools. And the reason is, as far as I can understand, is twofold. One, post-September 11th. Some trustees, after this happened, realized they didn't know anything about Islam. And then they realized if they didn't know anything, what did their students and their system know? They realized they weren't being taught anything, and they felt a responsibility. The other factor, public pressure. The board had announced that it might be open to the idea of allowing alternative religious programs in its system, and they were immediately deluged with requests to open alternative Christian schools. And so they kept debating this and discussing it, and finally one trustee said, maybe we're discussing the wrong question. Maybe the question shouldn't be, should we allow alternative religious schools? But maybe the question should be, what is the place of religion in schools? Now, Professor David Seljak here at St. Jerome's is doing an excellent job researching the state of religious teaching in world religions in Canada's public schools. And it's interesting to me that I had a chance to see some of his preliminary research, that the provinces that insist on the compulsory study of religion are those provinces that recently restructured and eliminated publicly funded religious schools, Newfoundland and Quebec. Only Quebec requires religious education throughout grade school and high school. And the province of Newfoundland and Labrador requires religious classes at the kindergarten to grade 9 levels. Now, I haven't seen details about the actual curriculum being offered, but the very fact that this is now considered a serious area of study suggests to me that the other provinces should start paying attention to what's going on in Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. At the very least, it seems to me that students should be exposed to a critical examination of history so they can understand how our fractured school system came to be. Another point, and to me this is fundamental, and that has to do with the right of children to be exposed to diversity of religious thought, to be challenged to think for themselves in issues of the spirit. Now, I know the rights of children is a controversial area. There are always going to be competing interests. There are the interests of the parents, for example. I mean, every parent wants their child to grow up valuing the things that they value. I mean, it's natural. And to that end, of course, they're going to strive to give them the opportunities and experiences to be in an environment where those values are going to be absorbed. And sending them to a school that promotes their religion is, of course, a primary way of parents to do that. But does that serve the child's interests when it comes to freedom of choice? They're the interests of the state. The state wants children to grow up to be good, contributing citizens. It isn't in the interest of the state to have young people grow up unable to communicate with their peers or understand the worldviews of their peers who grew up with a very different value system. The state also plays a role in protecting children from parents whose religious beliefs may infringe on the rights of the child. Now, we all have read stories about Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, where the parents are refusing medical treatment, and the state attempts to step in if that child's life is at stake. Or in the case of physical cruelty, where somebody in the name of God applies harsh corporal punishment. But there are also the interests of the child to consider. And it's amazing to me how few times that's actually addressed. Since 1924, we've had a Declaration of the Rights of the Child. And it's something that's constantly evolving. The declaration that exists today is certainly not the one that was back in 1924. But at its core is the idea that adults have the responsibility to do what is best for children. When it comes to education, to me, it means opening their minds, encouraging critical thinking, and ultimately allowing them to make their own decisions based on a truly broad education. I mean, at some point, young people do make up their minds about what's important to them. And religious conviction isn't real unless it stems from freedom of thought. If it's inherited, it's not terribly meaningful. It has to be done, it has to be made consciously. If it grows out of study and choice, then it is. But how do they make that choice if they aren't introduced to diversity of religious thought? Well, at the end of the day, I'm actually not very optimistic that we'll see any kind of major turnaround, any real commitment to fostering religious literacy in Canada's public schools. For one thing, there certainly are religious groups who wouldn't tolerate it. They do not want their children exposed to the beliefs and worldviews of people who don't share their convictions. In a system that respects religious thought and religious diversity. The problem is those people don't tend to be politically vocal or politically active. I'm also not optimistic because my work has exposed me to how threatened secularists are by religious inquiry in the classroom. They seem loath to accept that religion is a part of the human experience, and that learning about it is socially useful, that it's worthwhile, that it's a personally important pursuit. And in fact, I'm using mild language. Secularists go ballistic. They just can't even tolerate thinking about this issue. All of this has led me to believe that the public system is unlikely to take the inclusive route, to take the route to religious literacy. But if it isn't the public system, then who's going to set the standard? What is the alternative? Well, as I said before, the alternative I don't favor, but one I do find understandable in the face of the public schools' resistance, is to widen the separate school principle. To have the Muslims in their schools, the Hindus in theirs, the conservative Protestants in theirs, the Catholics in their schools, and so on. But if that's the only way we can go, then I don't think it's acceptable unless we tie funding to meeting certain minimum standards. And at the moment, Ontario has not gone that route. Its tax rebate system is not dependent upon meeting certain minimum standards. And yet, all Canadian children, it seems to me, regardless of the religious beliefs in the home, should be entitled to an education that will give them the opportunity to pursue university if they desire. And this means that they've got to be taught by certified teachers, and they need to follow the government curriculum. There should also be a requirement that social standards be adhered to, that there be respect for gender equality, that sensitivity to alternate worldviews be encouraged. But in closing, I'd actually like to propose another route. And it may seem radical, but maybe the avenue to an education system that acknowledges and respects religious diversity, that fosters religious literacy, is not the public system at all, but is the Catholic school system. Now, as I understand it, in many ways, this is already happening by default. Significant numbers of students from other religions, particularly Islam, are already attending Catholic schools in major urban centers. They're coming because their parents want them to have a quality education, as well as one that includes and respects religion even if it isn't their own. But as they begin to achieve a certain comfort level within the system, they're increasingly starting to make demands upon the Catholic system. They want their religious practices to be accommodated, whether it's setting aside a separate room for prayer or serving hella foods in the cafeteria. Wouldn't it be a lot better for the system to make a conscious effort to embrace religious diversity through setting far-sighted policy that actually addressed it? What if the Catholic separate school system accepted responsibility for contributing to the kind of education that this diverse country of ours so desperately needs? It seems to me that this is the time for educational leadership with the future in mind, rather than conservatism based on a legacy of the past. Wouldn't it be wonderful if it were the Catholic system, in response to the issues and concerns of today, that led the way? Thank you.
Yes, it works if you turn it on. Ivan has a microphone. I want to thank, first of all, Lois for a very a challenging and intelligent talk, and I really appreciated it. I just wanted to kind of note that you should take it easy on your student who didn't understand that Catholics weren't Christians, because as any sociologist of religion will tell you, that if we do a poll and we ask people, are you Christian, half of the Catholics in Canada will say no. It's true, and so you have to be very careful when you're polling. So it's a division that even Catholics have internalized, and that's because of the history of Canada and the anti-Catholicism. So to be Christian was to be Protestant, to be Catholic was so. So I thought I would plea for a little bit of understanding on behalf of your students. No, I wouldn't go that far. And I also wanted to just comment on the complaints about papal aggression and all these other practices. I thought it's so ironic. In the 1850s, you went to the Protestant press for those. Today, you'd have to look at Catholic authors for those same complaints. I'm not naming names. Anyway, I just really appreciated this talk, and I'm sure that we have lots of questions in the audience, and Ivan has a microphone. This lecture, like all our lectures, are taped, and therefore I'll ask you to ask your question into the microphone so we make sure that we get it on the tape. Otherwise, the people listening to the tape at home wonder what the heck Lois is talking about because they haven't heard the question. So if anyone will start us off. If you'll, excuse me, will you wait for the microphone? There it is.
If the children don't know the difference of that they are Christian, the Catholics don't know they are Christian, it shows they are ignorant. They don't get religion enough in school.
It's not the children, it's the adults who do that.
Well, if the adults don't know, well,
I agree.
How can the children then know?
I quite agree. It's changing.
And another thing, if this lady would go to another, if you would have an audience in a Muslim country, or in a Jews or Hindus or communist countries, how would you deal with them? Here, the Catholic we have 2,000 years, and now we are just simply are supposed to throw it to the street to everybody. I mean, it's precious. Catholic religion is precious. To me, you just seem to be very anti-Catholic.
Was that a question? Am I anti-Catholic?
Very much so.
Well, I'd like to hasten to assure you that I'm not. I don't believe I am. I would have thought that the proposal I was suggesting would maintain the integrity of the Catholic system. It would certainly be a possible route to upholding the ethics of Catholicism, which is, as Professor Seljak began by saying, here comes everybody.
No, excuse me, we have...
The question...
Schools, they are ignorant. The children are simply ignorant. How can they take on world religion when they don't know their own religion?
Okay, thank you very much.
You really touched on a lot of subjects, and I got the impression that it was kind of like a shotgun approach and touching on a lot of issues. When you talk about the formation of the school systems, education has always been a parent's primary right, and the government's formed school systems basically to comply with parents' wishes. And you mentioned about the different Protestant sects. They didn't have the numbers to start a school system. The Catholics did have, when we go back to the 1800s. And so they decided to amalgamate to form a public system. That was fine. The Catholics were invited into that. They declined simply because they had numbers of their own to have their own schools, and because of those religious concerns. So that's sort of the genesis. Now, what you're proposing now is an interesting concept, and I would suggest in practice it's sort of happening already in the Catholic system, because of, as you've indicated, religion and openness. They do teach world religions. They do respect world religions. But one of the concerns is if you have this whole melting pot with Muslims and all other kinds of religions entering into it, all of a sudden you've lost the control of the separate system. And that's what the concern is. You would wind up being no different than what the public system is today. Okay. That's what the fear is. So, on the one hand, I agree with you. On the other hand, there's a great sensitivity for losing a great system that is available. And like in our high schools, the high schools are open to all faiths. Now, there's no restrictions on it. So I think we got what you're saying already without losing control.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to respond to that?
Having taught during the past 5 decades in the public and separate school, in the last 15 years working with refugees from 58 countries in the KW region daily, 5 days a week. I'd like to briefly say that in the early 70s, I taught world religions in an elementary school as a principal. 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and during those 11 years as principal, I taught Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and I touched briefly on Taoism, Confucianism, Shintoism, Zoroastrianism, very, very, very briefly, the major 5 religions I dealt with in a Catholic school. I didn't really feel that I belittled the Roman Catholic faith, and I feel strongly with those students that I taught during those years, that we actually began to appreciate our Roman Catholic faith more so because we were exposed to people of these other faiths. So the question I have for you this evening is the following. How much time on the curriculum would you spend on Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Jainism, Shintoism, etc., because of our multicultural society here in Canada? That's a question I would ask on your curriculum.
Right. So we finally have a question, and it's a doozy, so I'll let you take it.
Well, the way that England has chosen to do this is because they have decided that it's important in their multicultural mix to address world religions, but they also want people to be aware of the fact of what the dominant or what the founding religion was of that country. So I can't remember what the proportion is, and in fact I think the proportion varies depending on the community that the school finds itself. but it may be, 70% Christianity would be taught, and then the remaining 30% of the time that you're going to allot to the teaching of world religions would be divided up according to what is reflected in that community. That's one approach. Another approach is simply to, there are a variety of approaches. I mean, this idea is not actually new. Calgary Board of Education had a variety of, the public education system had religious schools under its umbrella at one point. And the secularists were very upset because they thought there were too many conservative Christian schools starting, and they closed it down. They kicked out the trustees who brought it in and brought in new ones. And so the conservative Protestants ended up either going to their own separate schools, starting their own ones, or going into the public system. That left the Jewish school on its own. It was the Catholic school system that took the Jewish school under its wing as an alternative school. So you had a Jewish school as a school under the Catholic school system. That's one way of doing it. You might have an Islamic school under the Catholic school system, as ironic as all of this may sound. But that's one way of doing it, and showing the importance one wants to give to religious diversity, or bringing it into the classroom through a curriculum that has been devised that really you've got 12 years to deal with it, right? And I think it's amazing and wonderful that you did that for so many years. I would have loved to have been a student in your class. Every student that I've talked to who's had the opportunity to study world religions has confirmed how interesting this has been, how much it's opened their eyes, and I would say, even most importantly, how it has challenged them to think themselves about what they believe and has enriched them in their own faith, as you point out.
Yes, question there.
Hello. I'm hearing a lot of things that confirm my own experience in both, by the way, public and Catholic school systems in Ontario. I began in the one, I finished in the other, and I finished in a rather unique setting where, unlike some other levels of the system, we didn't look for or ask for or care about baptismal certificates. But I think perhaps what is needed and where you could devote your energies usefully would be in the exploration of this question. What is it about the aggressive ignorance of the Ontario public school system that has come to dominate the Canadian secular media?
Could you repeat that question?
Yes. Okay. Why is it that the aggressive ignorance of matters religious that dominates the Ontario public school system also dominates the Canadian secular media? That's...
I guess he's asking about the secular humanism that you were talking about dominating the public school is also present in the public media.
It seems to be, and I've seen some evidence of it, that it is uniquely Ontario, and yet the Ontario public school system attitude pervades the media nationally. The National Post is like an example of collective ignorance.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the people who are now the policymakers, or the editors, or the publishers, are themselves a product of a system that they're reacting against. I mean, a system like the one when I was in going to school, and we had a minister come in every week and proselytize. We were not at all encouraged to think about the meaning of what Jesus had to say. We were told to memorize it. The ministers came in and they proselytized. We were forced to say prayers. We were not, there was no encouragement to see this as personally meaningful. And in fact, it was presented in a way that would do just the opposite. And I think that that it's that kind of experience, either in the schools or growing up in homes where they were confronted with people from a faith who were intolerant, who were hypocritical, who may say, yes, we love everybody, except, of course, the homosexuals and the this and the that, and saying, well, we don't want anything to do with it. And those people are the people now who are in powerful positions and are making sure that they only see the pursuit of religion or religious study in those kinds of terms because that was their experience and they're not thinking beyond it. I don't know, there may be other reasons that other people could come up with. I have given it thought, and that's the only one that really makes sense to me. I don't think that it's higher education that leads people to lose their faith.
Hi, I'm currently studying at the Faculty of Education at Western towards my Bachelor of Education, and one of my teachables is religion in the Catholic system. After our practice teaching experiences, students in my religion theory and learning class come together and talk about what we've experienced. And a number of my peers have taught the World Religions course, and I was completely taken aback when I heard some of their experiences. They were introducing Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam to their students, and they would give them opportunities to do things like Buddhist meditation, or for a Hinduism project, one student teacher wanted the students to create a new Hindu god, and this is what she was allowed to do. And one of the problems was, not just from her, but other people's experiences in different activities, was parents calling and complaining that this teacher was trying to convert their child. And in fact, in one case, it was a student who refused to do the project because she didn't feel comfortable with it. My question is, how does a teacher deal with this when they're teaching world religions, and in, say, the system that you propose of religion being taught from a young age, of all faiths and tolerance? How does how do you propose we're going to deal with these problems, and do you anticipate them in this system?
Well, I have a couple of things to say. One is I find it really peculiar that an assignment would be given to create a Hindu god. I mean, that's just... Create a Hindu god? Wow. Wow, I mean, I just find that really peculiar. And in fact, it leads me to the point I would like to make, which is that clearly, I mean, teachers need to be educated in how to teach this. And at the moment, teachers aren't being educated, except within the Catholic system. They're not being educated about how to teach world religions in a way that is every bit as considered a legitimate form of study as history or geography or science. And that's what's required, is to see it as a legitimate subject of study, in which case, it goes through a lot of hoops. It's got to be, the curriculum has to be created by people who are knowledgeable. The teachers have to be trained, and there has to be a good kind of communication with the parents about what the object of study is. I mean, if you've got a situation like that, of course you're going to have people upset and refusing to participate.
I think that, if Lois's proposal leads to public school classes in which children are asked to add a fourth person to the Trinity, I don't think really that's what we're looking for.
To me, that's the equivalent. That is the kind of equivalent.
I have a question, since I've done a lot of thinking about this, Lois. You proposed two models, and as you know, even in the question of race, African Americans are divided among themselves. There are the integrationists, and people who believe in setting up black colleges, for example, to deal with their problems. So I'm not sure. I mean, so even in that regard, there are differences. It seems to me that there are multiculturalists who argue that we need public schools. We need everyone in public schools so that Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists can all rub shoulders and learn to tolerate one another. On the other hand, people who want independent or separate religiously based schools are saying, you know, people just aren't Hindus. They're not just Catholics. They have to become Catholics. And and they have to become Hindus. They have to be socialized into those identities. In other words, you can't have children at a public school, all of a sudden they're just Muslims. They're not going to get that just from being born into a Muslim family. Just like I imagine supporters of Catholic education would say that you don't just become a Catholic because your parents are Catholic and you go to church. Part of the Catholic school system is what makes us Catholic, and which, when we come here at a Catholic university, raises the Catholic culture to a certain level where we can have intelligent debates about contentious issues such as this one and others. So what would you say to those people who would insist that that multiculturalism that doesn't allow sufficient formation into a tradition or socialization into a tradition, that kind of multiculturalism is too thin for them? That a real multiculturalism would allow more of this element of socialization into a particular tradition, and yet also being open to a multicultural or pluralistic reality.
But what's the role of the home and the school, the synagogue or the church? I mean, those are, to my mind, the places for formation of value systems that are near and dear to the parents. Those are the ways in which they learn and inculcate that kind of identity. We don't have very many places in our society where that are common meeting grounds. I mean, ultimately in the workplace, yes, but that's when we're adults. What do we have as young people? I mean, the schools are sort of a basic kind of meeting ground. And once they come to school, they've had what certainly many people argue are the most formative years in their life have taken place in the home before they get to school. And the parents have lots of opportunity to instill in their children the values that are important to them. So I don't actually buy that argument.
So what if you want an economy or a political society which reflects values that are different from the normative liberal values that you find in society? In other words, what I'm saying is, what if parishes and families cannot provide the level of education and the level of socialization that people want? This is
that's when they go to their own private schools that now get a tax rebate.
Okay. We've got lots of hands up, so Ivan's going to have to run if he doesn't want a long blank period on the tape. Right.
Probably yell loud enough without that.
I think part of what I'm hearing that I think is really positive in your proposal, Lois, is that it talks to us about teaching children as whole people. As a elementary teacher in the Catholic school system, what I think is one of the gifts of being in the school system that I'm in is that I can teach to the spirituality of children, that I can help them to explore their spirituality. When I have a teenage daughter who is in a Catholic system, come to me and say, I'm not sure if I believe this part. I'm not sure if I buy that. And what I feel good about is that I can say to her, go into your religion class and talk to the people in there. Talk to your peers who are in an environment where religion is a topic that's discussed. Bring that concern up within a religion class and be in an environment where you can explore that. I'm not concerned about her being lost or about her turning away, because I know she's exposed to and has the opportunity to explore that. I feel it is my job to church her, okay? She comes with me to church. She practices what we practice as a family. What she believes is hers. And I can't do that for her, and I can't give that. I can expose her to it, but I can't have her believe what I believe. But the benefit of having religion, of whatever faith, as part of education, is that that is an integral part of who we are as people and who we are as humans. And whether we expose them to a variety of options in terms of how to practice our spirituality is not threatening to me, but I think is very important to the development of them as children.
Hi, Lois. Thanks for coming. Sort of a two-part question, and it's kind of going along with some things that have been asked and discussed here this evening. I have to start out by saying world religions, I think, is probably the most important course we teach in Catholic high schools. But with that, I think it can also be the most dangerous for the following reason. If you get a teacher in there who's there to say everything else is wrong, and in essence, what we're doing is creating less understanding rather than more, because there are teachers we know that will simply teach world religions to point out the faults of others. So there's a concern I have with that, and it all ties into the statement earlier about the qualities of the teachers that are teaching this course. Because as we also know in our Catholic high schools, quite often you'll have teachers who don't have degrees in religion teaching the courses. So that's part of my concern, is that people who haven't studied world religions are actually teaching it. But even a greater concern for me is in the public high schools, where they've watered it down so much that it essentially is only a history course. And I guess I would ask you how you would feel about that, in the sense that a student at a public school here in town could take world religions, and essentially all they're getting is history, because they are so afraid to talk about faith and faith development and what it might mean to the individuals in the class.
Well, I mean, if I were a teacher in the public system, I'd be pretty concerned too, because there have been a number of court cases, and even if they're teaching a world religions course, who knows what could happen with it. But I think that's a shame if it just ends up being a watered down history course. I mean, ideally, it seems to me you introduce that material in history classes way before grade 11, and by the time they're in grade 11, they should be at a pretty sophisticated way of thinking and analyzing about these things. But it really is a process that I think has to start young, and has to come through a system that A, is committed, B, has pretty good guidelines, and C, has qualified teachers doing it. Certainly the British example is that their teachers are qualified. They're not allowed to teach religion or teach world religions unless they have taken special training in this. And one of the people I was talking to said, what they have found from their experience are there are two kinds of really bad religion teachers. One are the people who really, really, really don't believe, and the other are the people who really, really, really do believe something. And that the best teachers are actually humanists, people who think that this is a legitimate course of study, and approach it with curiosity, but don't approach it with, I've got a vested interest in this, and I'm going to tell you what my point of view is. That to them, that's been their experience. But to address what you were saying about a child being able to go to someone who is specifically trained in your religion, you could still have that under the kind of system that I'm suggesting. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be possible for you to have both a system that taught or incorporated the study of world religions through art and history and music and these sorts of things, but also had individual and specific classes for Muslims on Islam, for Catholics on Catholicism, for conservative Protestants. They'd want, and believe me, I think many of them would want to come into this system if it was devised that way. So I think there are ways to do it. When my book came out, I actually went on a tour and had to be on radio programs and this sort of thing, arguing for teaching the serious study of religion in the schools. And I felt absolutely battered by the time. Sometimes I really felt it was, let's just kill this person right now and get it over with. And a lot of the anger came from teachers, which I really do understand, because for them it was, geez, first it's driver education, then sex education, and now it's religion. Foist everything on us. What happened to the home? And try as I might to argue about it to present it as a legitimate form of study, like geography, people still saw it as just sort of shifting the responsibility from the home onto the school. And it's hard for people to think otherwise. And I don't know how long it's going to take to get this message out, but it's not something that people accept or understand easily.
I'd like to put you on the spot here, Lois. You've done this marvelous book, and you have so many great anecdotes in it. What is the strangest thing you've come across in your research on religion in public schools or religion in education in Canada?
Why didn't you forewarn me? The strangest?
I was going to say, with the exception of tonight, because
this stems from the research, and this sort of brings us right back to the beginning of tonight. About a year ago, I was invited to be on a television show. It was a Christian television program, and I, talked about the importance of teaching religion in the schools, and that was fine. I got home. A week later, I got a card from the producer thanking me for being on the program and thanking me for sticking up for religion in schools, even though, she said, you are not a Christian. So, who knows? I mean, you just have no idea the kind of impression one's giving. I am a Christian. Okay.
Or the new Hindu goddess, we're not sure. We have a question here.
I don't know. Question, Lois. It's just I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, and it's taken me some time to process what you've said, and I'm trying to think about my own experience with teaching and being taught. And I think one of the things that I've learned through teaching at home and in school and teaching is that what I'm about anyway is actually character development based on principles. And when I look at my relationship, my interaction with people who are not Catholic or maybe not even Christian, what that's allowed me to do is probably to be much more authentic in my dealings with people, because I'm coming from some principled way of being, character, and I can recognize it in other people, I think. What I fear and what I wonder is, you talked about the Dutch experience, and I've heard this before too. Is it not fair to say that, in fact, if we lose that, what in fact is the basis of our ability to relate to other people? Does it in fact become that we really don't have a basis, that it is a melting pot, that it's just cognitive up here, it's not a way of being? Does that make sense?
If we lose what?
If we lose
the Catholic system of education?
Well, not even just the Catholic system. I mean, schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools, schools that actually attempt to form character based on religious principles or spiritual principles. And I don't see that. In fact, I'd like to suggest to you that is the basis of multiculturalism.
Well, it's certainly one expression of it, and I don't think we're ever going to lose those schools. I mean, more and more and more of them are opening up. The reason for them one can only guess at. Sometimes it almost seems as if they're a way of retreating into a community where they do feel comfortable, where they do have can feel that they can be who they are because they don't feel accepted in the wider system. And certainly the French experience is that when that happens, when people become isolated, then it actually fosters a kind of extremism that can be socially dangerous. Anyway, I don't think that these schools are going to disappear. As I said before, I think there are always people for whom you can't ever make them happy. They have to have their own teachers. I mean, I went to some schools where they refused to have qualified, certified teachers because they believe that the only teacher should be God. And so they deliberately have teachers. In fact, this is the strangest, most upsetting school I saw. It was a Christian Protestant school, and it's called, they've changed the name. They're called PACE, Accelerated Christian Education, ACE, and now they're called Schools for Tomorrow. And believe me, they're in your community. They're definitely here, but they tend to be in church basements. They tend to be hidden away because they actually don't want too much attention. But they refuse to have a qualified teacher because they believe the relationship should be with God. And so they have curriculum material that comes straight from Florida, and where God lives, yes. And everything is by rote. Everything, the student sits in a cubicle, and they have two flags on their desk, a Canadian flag and a Christian flag. I didn't know there was a Christian flag, but there's a Christian flag. And if their work has been filled out so that the unqualified person can mark it, they put up the Christian flag. No, the Canadian flag, sorry. And if they have to go to the bathroom, they put up the Christian flag. But they have to, the girls wear, they can't show their shoulder blades for some reason. And the boys have to have their hair cut right here because it says in the Bible these particular things. But they sit at these cubicles. There isn't a sound. And all day long, these kids are huddled over, filling in the same thing over and over and over again. And all of the words are, Peter Pilgrim met Mrs. Angel on the road, and, everything has some sort of biblical or uses Bible words. There is no critical thinking whatsoever. There's no way that these students really graduate with an education that would allow them to go to university. So the way the Alberta government's gotten around it is that they will accept them as foreign students because they've graduated with a curriculum from Florida. Anyway, to my mind, this is really depressing stuff. And this is the sort of school that there are people who want that. As I say, they're in every province in Canada. The Quebec government's very concerned about their proliferation, but they're more they figure they can't do anything about the curriculum because parents ultimately do have the right to make those decisions for their children. But they're really concerned about their safety because they're in these basements, their safety conditions aren't being met, and they're afraid there's going to be a fire and they're going to be burned. Anyway, those schools are going to continue. I think alternate religious schools are going to continue, but to my mind, you have to look at the whole picture, and that includes the rights of the child to be exposed to perspectives that are beyond their immediate family or church.
I think the time is getting on, so with that wonderful example, we will say thank you to Lois, and I'm going to ask Dr. Bonner to come up and thank Lois for all of us.